I was sold on a Tuesday, in the rain, for the price of a mediocre horse. £10 sterling, counted out in coins that clinked against the wooden table like the closing notes of a funeral hymn. And just like that, I belonged to a man whose face I had never seen, and whose name I learned only when the ink was already dry. They called me mute. They called me broken. They called me nothing at all, most days, which suited me fine because I had learned long ago that silence was the only armor a woman like me could afford. My name is Vivian Ashworth, though for 3 years before that rainy Tuesday, I was known only as the quiet one, the strange one, the girl who never speaks. I let them believe it. I let them believe I had no voice, no words, no thoughts worth hearing. It was easier that way. Safer. And in a world that had taken everything else from me, my silence was the one thing I could control. But I am getting ahead of myself. To understand how I came to stand in that cold drawing room, my wrists still bearing the faint marks of too tight gloves and my heart beating with the resigned rhythm of a woman who had stopped hoping, you must first understand who I was before the silence, before the fall, before I learned that a woman's worth could be measured in pounds and pence and the willingness of men to look the other way. I was born in Vienna in the winter of 1822, to a mother who loved too freely and a father who loved not at all. My mother was the Countess Marguerite de Valcourt, a Frenchwoman of impeccable breeding and impossible beauty who had fled the remnants of revolutionary chaos to find refuge in the glittering courts of the Austrian Empire. She had hair the color of burnished copper, eyes like sea glass, and a laugh that could fill a ballroom and make everyone in it feel as though they were the only person who mattered. She was extraordinary, my mother. She was light itself. My father was Sir Edmund Ashworth, a British diplomat whose charm was exceeded only by his cowardice. He had the kind of handsome face that opens doors and the kind of weak character that ensures those doors eventually slam shut. They met at a ball in the Hofburg Palace, where the chandeliers dripped crystal tears and the music seemed to promise that the night would never end. They fell into each other's arms with the reckless passion of people who believe consequences are for lesser souls. And 9 months later, I arrived, inconvenient and illegitimate, a living testament to a love that should never have been. My mother, to her credit, refused to hide me. In an age when illegitimate offspring were secrets to be buried, she declared me openly as her daughter and dared society to make something of it. She raised me in her apartments in Vienna, then in Prague, then in Rome, then in St. Petersburg, following the diplomatic circuits like a shadow that moved just behind the light. We lived in grand borrowed rooms and shabby rented flats, in palaces and pension houses, always moving, always adapting, always surviving on my mother's wit and charm and the generosity of friends who adored her. I learned French at her knee, the language of our hearts, the words she whispered to me at bedtime and sang over me when I was ill. German came next. From her Austrian friends who gathered in her salon to discuss politics and philosophy and the scandalous behavior of this countess or that prince. Italian arrived through the servants who adored her, teaching me their tongue in exchange for the kindness she showed them. Russian came from a tutor she hired when I was 7, a fierce old woman named Madame Orlova, who had fled some political disaster she never spoke of and who drilled vocabulary into me with the determination of a general training troops. By the time I was 12, I could move through a ballroom in any capital of Europe and understand every whispered secret, every veiled insult, every desperate declaration of love. Languages came to me like breathing. My mother said it was a gift from God, compensation for the legitimacy he had denied me. I did not yet know it would become both my salvation and my curse. My father, Sir Edmund, acknowledged me in private and denied me in public. He sent money when he remembered, which was rarely. He visited when it was convenient, which was even more rarely. He looked at me with a mixture of guilt and irritation that I came to recognize as the particular expression of a man who resents the evidence of his own weakness. I was proof of his transgression, walking and talking and bearing his features in a face that could not be hidden or denied. He would have preferred if I had never existed at all. When I was 14, he secured me a place in a prestigious finishing school in Switzerland, Les Trois Couronnes, less out of paternal affection than a desire to remove me from the circuits where he conducted his affairs. My presence embarrassed him. My existence complicated his carefully constructed public persona. Shipping me off to a mountain school was the easiest solution to a problem he had created and resented having to solve. My mother wept when I left. She stood on the platform of the Vienna train station, her copper hair escaping its pins, her sea-glass eyes swimming with tears she refused to shed in front of the other passengers. She held my face in her hands and made me promise to write every week. She promised to come for me when the season ended, when she had saved enough money, when circumstances allowed. She promised so many things, my mother, and I believed every one of them because I could not bear to imagine a world in which her promises meant nothing. She died 3 months later. A fever, they said. It swept through the city where she was staying, claiming dozens of lives, and hers was simply one among many. But I knew the truth. I knew that she had been weakened by years of struggle, by the constant effort of maintaining appearances on dwindling resources, by the heartbreak of loving a man who refused to love her back. She died of a broken heart, and my father did not even come to her funeral. He sent a letter instead, a brief and businesslike missive informing the school authorities that arrangements should be made and expenses would be covered. I learned of her death through a separate letter from his secretary, a man I had never met who wrote with the detached efficiency of someone recording a minor business transaction. The Countess de Valcourt had passed. My school fees would continue to be paid until I reached the age of 18, at which point I would need to make my own arrangements. There was no expression of sympathy, no acknowledgement of what I had lost. Just columns of figures and the cold assurance that I would not be his problem for much longer. I remember reading that letter in the small room I shared with 2 other girls, feeling the words sink into me like stones dropped into deep water. My mother was dead. My mother, who had been my whole world, who had loved me fiercely and protected me always, who had promised to come for me when the season ended. She was gone, and I was alone, and the world had revealed itself to be exactly as cruel as she had always tried to shield me from knowing. I did not cry. Not then, not for many months afterward. The grief was too vast for tears, too enormous to be expressed through something as simple as weeping. Instead, it settled into my bones like a permanent chill, a cold that I carried with me everywhere and could not seem to shake no matter how close I sat to the fire or how many blankets I wrapped around myself. I remained at the school for 4 more years, wrapped in that grief so profound that it felt like drowning in slow motion. I studied because studying was the only thing that made sense, the only activity that did not require me to feel. I excelled because excellence was expected and failure would have meant drawing attention to myself, which I could not bear. I added Spanish to my repertoire through a new instructor who arrived my 3rd year, then Latin through the classical studies curriculum, then Greek through my own stubborn determination to master every language the school had to offer. I buried myself in words because words were the only companions I had left. The other girls whispered about me, the strange foreign one with no family and no prospects, the girl who spoke 6 languages but rarely spoke at all. They made up stories about me, each more lurid than the last. I was the secret daughter of a foreign prince. I was a spy in training. I was cursed, haunted, touched by madness. I heard all their theories and said nothing, because what did it matter? They did not know me. They could not touch me. I had built walls around myself so high and so thick that nothing could penetrate them. When I turned 18, my father summoned me to London. I went with something almost like hope, foolish as that seems now. Perhaps, I thought, he wished to finally acknowledge me. Perhaps he had a plan for my future, some position or marriage or arrangement that would give my life direction. Perhaps losing my mother had awakened some dormant paternal instinct, some desire to make amends for all the years of neglect. I was wrong, of course. I was always wrong about him. He met me in his study, a grand room in a grand house in Mayfair, lined with leather-bound books he had never read and decorated with artifacts from his diplomatic travels. He looked older than I remembered, grayer and more tired, with a persistent cough that punctuated his sentences like unwelcome interruptions. He did not rise when I entered. He did not embrace me or offer condolences for my mother's death. He simply gestured to a chair and began speaking as if continuing a conversation we had already been having. "I am dying," he said, and the words carried no particular weight. "Some disease of the lungs, the doctors say. A year at most, more likely months." He coughed as if to illustrate the point. "I have made arrangements for my legitimate family, of course. My wife and sons will be well provided for, but you present a particular problem." I sat in the chair he had indicated and folded my hands in my lap and said nothing. What was there to say? He was dying, and his first concern was how to dispose of me efficiently. "My wife knows about you," he continued. "She has always known, though we have never spoken of it directly. But now, with my health failing, she has made certain demands. She will not nurse me through my final illness while the evidence of my infidelity remains visible. She wants you gone, removed, erased from any connection to our family." "I see," I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears. Flat, distant, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. "I have found a solution that suits everyone," he went on. "A man named Mr. Horace Pemberton, a distant relation on my mother's side. He has agreed to take you on as his ward in exchange for a modest sum and your silence about the family connection. You will live in his household, assist with domestic duties, and under no circumstances reveal your true parentage to anyone. You are selling me," I said. The words came out before I could stop them. My father's eyes flickered with something that might have been shame or might have been merely irritation at having his actions named so bluntly. "I am providing for you. I am ensuring that you have a roof over your head and food in your stomach. I am fulfilling my obligations." "Your obligations." I tasted the word like something bitter. "You have never fulfilled an obligation to me in your life." "Watch your tongue," he said, and for a moment I saw the steel beneath his weakness, the coldness that my mother had somehow loved despite everything. "You are in no position to be particular. Pemberton is willing to take you. That is more than most men would offer for a girl of your circumstances." I wanted to scream. I wanted to weep. I wanted to take one of those leather-bound books he had never read and hurl it at his head. I wanted to tell him exactly what I thought of his obligations, his arrangements, his convenient solution. But I did none of those things. I had learned, somewhere in those 4 years of grief and silence at Les Trois Couronnes, that expressing my feelings only gave others power over me. So I swallowed my rage and my pain and my desperate, futile hope, and I simply nodded. "When do I leave?" I asked. "Tomorrow." He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. The sooner the better, given the circumstances. I curtsied, the movement automatic, and walked out of his study without looking back. That night, I packed my few possessions into a small trunk and lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling of the guest room where I had been placed like a piece of unwanted furniture. And the next morning, I was delivered to Mr. Horace Pemberton like a parcel whose postage had already been paid. Mr. Pemberton was exactly as unpleasant as I had expected. He was a failed academic, a man who had once harbored dreams of scholarly greatness and had watched them wither into nothing. He drowned his disappointments in gin and bitterness, both of which he dispensed freely to everyone around him. His house was a cramped and dirty place in an unfashionable part of London, filled with dusty books and broken furniture and the sour smell of alcohol and despair. He had expected, when he agreed to take me on, a meek young woman he could use as an unpaid servant, an eventual bride for his equally unpleasant nephew, a young man named Cecil, who had the watery eyes of a drunk and the wandering hands of a predator. What he got instead was a ghost, a shadow, a woman who moved through his household like smoke and never uttered a single word. The silence began that first day, though I did not plan it consciously. Cecil cornered me in the hallway within an hour of my arrival, pressing me against the wall and breathing his sour breath into my face, while his hands explored places they had no right to touch. I could have screamed. I could have protested. But some instinct told me that screaming and protesting would only make things worse, would only mark me as difficult, would only give them more reason to punish me. So instead, I went completely still and completely silent. I let my eyes go blank. I let my face become a mask. And when Cecil finally released me with a frustrated curse, I walked away without a word and began scrubbing the kitchen floor as if nothing had happened. Mr. Pemberton noticed my silence within the first week. He tried to get me to speak, first through commands, then through threats, then through blows that left bruises I hid beneath my sleeves. But I had discovered something powerful in my muteness, something that even his cruelty could not touch. As long as I did not speak, they could not truly reach me. As long as I remained silent, I retained some small piece of myself that they could not steal. Eventually, Mr. Pemberton gave up. He began telling everyone I was mute, damaged, useless, except for the most menial tasks. Some trauma, he would say, with false sympathy when visitors asked. The poor creature cannot speak a word. We took her in out of charity, of course. Christian duty and all that. I let him tell his lies. I scrubbed his floors and mended his shirts and cooked his meals and endured his nephew's escalating attempts at intimacy. And through it all, I never spoke. Not when Mr. Pemberton screamed at me. Not when Cecil cornered me in the pantry and whispered threats about what he would do when we were married. Not when the other servants took their cues from the master and treated me like I was less than human, spitting in my food and stealing my few possessions and making my life a daily exercise in humiliation and survival. My silence became my fortress. My silence became my revenge. They thought I was broken, and in thinking so, they stopped watching me carefully. They stopped guarding their words. They said things in front of me that they would never say to anyone who could repeat them. And I listened. God, how I listened. I learned everything about Mr. Pemberton's failing finances, his desperate schemes, his unpaid debts. I learned about Cecil's gambling habits and his visits to brothels and the growing chorus of creditors who came knocking at the door. I learned about the servants' petty thefts and secret romances and bitter resentments. I gathered information like a magpie gathering shiny things, storing it away in my memory for some future purpose I could not yet name. 3 years passed in this manner. 3 years of scrubbing and starving and surviving on nothing but the stubborn refusal to let them win. I was 21 years old, and I had no prospects, no protectors, no future beyond the slow, grinding misery of a life that had never truly been my own. I had accepted this. I had made my peace with it, or something close to peace. I would endure until I could endure no longer, and then I would simply stop, like a candle burning down to nothing. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The Duke of Ashford came to Mr. Pemberton's house on a Tuesday in late September, when the rain was falling in sheets and the whole world seemed determined to be as gray and miserable as my heart. I did not know he was coming. I did not know anything about him except what I had overheard from the servants, which was that he was wealthy, powerful, cold as a winter grave, and desperate to find a wife before some mysterious deadline that no one seemed to fully understand. I was scrubbing the front steps when his carriage arrived, my hands red and raw from the lye soap, my dress soaked through from the rain. I was too absorbed in my work to notice the fine black horses or the gilded coat of arms on the door. It was only when a pair of polished boots appeared in my line of vision that I looked up and saw him for the first time. He was not handsome, not in the conventional sense. His features were too sharp, too angular. his brow too heavy and his jaw too severe. He had dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that suggested either carelessness or deliberate dishevelment, and eyes the color of storm clouds, gray and deep and utterly unreadable. There was something about him that commanded attention, a presence that seemed to fill the space around him and push everything else to the margins. He looked at me the way one might look at a piece of furniture, assessing and dismissing in the same glance. And then he stepped over me and into the house as if I were nothing more than a particularly inconvenient puddle. I should have been offended. I should have felt something, anger or humiliation, or at least the sting of being so thoroughly dismissed. But I had long since stopped expecting to be seen, and his dismissal was simply confirmation of what I already knew. I was invisible. I was nothing. I was a woman on her knees in the rain, and he was a duke who did not even register my existence. I did not learn until later what transpired in Mr. Pemberton's study that afternoon. I did not learn until the ink was dry and the coins were counted and my fate was sealed that the Duke of Ashford had come looking for a wife, and Mr. Pemberton, ever opportunistic, had offered me. A mute bride. He called me. A woman who would cause no trouble, make no demands, and never embarrass the Duke with foolish chatter or unwanted opinions. Perfect for a man who needed only to satisfy the terms of a will and had no interest in the complications of actual matrimony. £10 was a bargain, Mr. Pemberton assured him, for a woman who would never speak a word of complaint. I learned all of this, standing in the same drawing room where I had scrubbed the floors that very morning, listening to Mr. Pemberton explain my deficiencies to the Duke as if I were not present. "She is mute," he said, gesturing toward me with the careless wave of a man displaying damaged merchandise. "Has been since she arrived 3 years ago. Some trauma, I expect, though she has never been able to communicate the details. She was in this condition when my family took her in out of Christian charity. I kept my eyes lowered, my face blank, my hands folded in front of me. I had perfected this posture over 3 years of servitude, the perfect picture of meek submission. She can read and write a little," Mr. Pemberton continued, "enough to follow simple instructions. But she has no real education to speak of, no family, no connections, no one who would miss her or make inquiries. She is, in short, exactly what you need, Your Grace. A wife in name only, one who will never trouble you with demands or expectations or the tiresome requirements of conversation." The Duke studied me throughout this recitation, his storm-gray eyes moving over my face with an intensity that made me want to shrink into the wallpaper and disappear entirely. I forced myself to remain still, to keep my expression vacant, to give no sign of the thoughts racing through my mind. I was the mute girl, the broken one, the nothing. I had played this role for 3 years. I knew every note, every gesture, every careful absence of reaction. "Is she healthy?" the Duke asked, and his voice was deeper than I expected, rougher, as if it had been worn down by years of commands and disappointments. "Perfectly healthy," Mr. Pemberton assured him, "strong as an ox, despite her size. She has worked in my household for 3 years without a single day of illness, never complains, never asks for anything, never causes the slightest trouble. And she truly cannot speak? Not a single word?" "Not one, Your Grace. I have tried everything, believe me. Doctors, tonics, even a specialist who claimed he could cure such conditions. Nothing works. She is as silent as the grave." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence I felt the weight of my entire future pressing down on me. I did not want to marry him. I did not want to marry anyone, least of all a cold-eyed stranger who was purchasing me like livestock. But I also knew that I could not survive another year in Mr. Pemberton's house. Cecil's advances were growing bolder, more insistent, more dangerous. It was only a matter of time before he stopped asking and started taking. And the alternatives, the workhouse, the streets, the slow death of poverty, were worse than any marriage could be. At least as a duchess, I would have food, shelter, a bed that did not reek of mildew and despair, At least as a duchess, I would be safe from Cecil's grasping hands and Mr. Pemberton's casual cruelties. It was not hope, exactly, but it was something. A chance. A change. A door opening onto a future that might be marginally less terrible than the present. "I will take her," the Duke said finally, and the words fell into the room like stones dropped into still water. £10, as we agreed. Have her ready to leave within the hour. And that was how I became the Duchess of Ashford. No courtship, no proposal, no tender words or stolen glances. Just £10, and the scratching of a pen and the cold certainty that I had been purchased like a bolt of cloth or a side of beef. I gathered my few possessions in a daze, my movements mechanical and automatic. A worn dress that had once been my mother's, mended so many times that almost none of the original fabric remained. A tattered shawl that still carried, faintly, the scent of her perfume. A locket containing a miniature portrait of her that I had hidden from Mr. Pemberton since the day I arrived, tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the attic room where I slept. These 3 things were all I had left of her, all I had left of the life I had lived before the silence. I followed the Duke to his carriage without a backward glance. Mr. Pemberton did not say goodbye. He did not thank me for 3 years of unpaid labor or wish me well in my new life. He simply counted his coins and nodded in satisfaction, already calculating how he would spend his unexpected windfall. Cecil watched from the window with an expression I could not read and did not care to examine. Fury, perhaps, at losing his intended victim. Or maybe just confusion at how his plans had so suddenly unraveled. Either way, I did not care. I was leaving, I was escaping. I was stepping into a carriage that would carry me away from this house of horrors and into a future I could not begin to imagine. The carriage was the finest I had ever been in, all velvet cushions and polished mahogany and the faint scent of leather and something else. Something masculine and unfamiliar that I would later learn to associate with the Duke himself. A cologne, perhaps, or simply the smell of a man who could afford to be clean. He sat across from me, his long legs stretched out, his eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window, and did not speak a single word for the entire journey. I was grateful for the silence. I was always grateful for silence. But this silence was different from the oppressive quiet of Mr. Pemberton's house, different from the tense stillness of a room where violence might erupt at any moment. This silence was neutral, peaceful almost, the comfortable quiet of 2 strangers who had no expectations of each other and therefore no reason to perform. The journey to Ashford Hall took several hours, carrying us out of London and into the countryside, through villages whose names I did not know, and past fields that stretched to the horizon like green and golden seas. I watched the landscape change through the window, marking our progress by the shifting scenery, and tried not to think about what awaited me at the end of the road. We arrived as darkness was falling, and the great house rose up out of the mist like something from a Gothic novel. Ashford Hall was everything Mr. Pemberton's cramped and squalid residence was not. Grand, imposing, beautiful in the way that only old money could make things beautiful, with the casual elegance of generations who had never known want. Towers and mullioned windows and ivy climbing the ancient stone walls, a sweeping drive lined with torches that flickered like earthbound stars in the gathering gloom. Servants lined the front steps, their faces carefully blank, their eyes curious despite their training. I saw them assessing me as I climbed down from the carriage, and I knew exactly what they were thinking. This was their new mistress. This shabby, silent creature in her threadbare dress and her mud-splattered boots. This was what their master had chosen. I did not blame them for their skepticism. I shared it. The Duke led me inside without ceremony, through a great hall hung with portraits of ancestors who all seemed to share his sharp features and disapproving gaze. Past drawing rooms with furniture draped in protective cloths, past a library whose shelves stretched toward the ceiling like walls of leather and gold, past a dining room that could have held 50 guests with room to spare, up a sweeping staircase with a banister polished by generations of hands, down a corridor lined with doors that led to rooms I could not begin to imagine, and finally, to a suite of chambers that were to be my own. A bedroom with a 4-poster bed draped in blue silk, a dressing room with a vanity and a wardrobe large enough to hold 100 dresses, though I owned only 2. A small sitting room with a fire already burning in the grate, casting dancing shadows on walls papered in a delicate floral pattern, more luxury than I had seen in years, more space than I knew what to do with. A cage, yes, but a gilded one. And after 3 years in Mr. Pemberton's hovel, even a gilded cage looked like paradise. "These are your rooms," the Duke said, the first words he had spoken since we left London. His voice echoed slightly in the silence, filling the space with its deep resonance. "My own chambers are in the east wing. You will not be disturbed." He paused, and something flickered across his face. Too quick to name. Some emotion I could not identify, there and gone in an instant. "I expect nothing from you," he continued, "except your presence at meals and your attendance at any social functions I deem necessary. Beyond that, you may do as you please. The servants will see to your needs. If you require anything, write it down and give the note to Mrs. Blackwood, the housekeeper. She will ensure your requests are fulfilled." He turned to leave, and I should have let him go. I should have sunk into the blessed silence of my new prison and counted my meager blessings. A bed that did not smell of mildew. Food that would not be spit in before it reached my plate. Freedom from Cecil's wandering hands and Mr. Pemberton's casual violence. These were gifts beyond anything I had dared to hope for. But something made me reach out, made me catch his sleeve, made me meet his eyes for the first time since that moment on the steps when he had looked through me as if I were made of glass. He stopped, stared at my hand on his arm, stared at me. I released him immediately, my heart pounding, my face flushing with a heat I had not felt in years. I did not know why I had done it. I did not know what I wanted from him. I only knew that in that moment I had wanted him to see me. Just for a second, just long enough to know that I was real, that I existed, that I was something more than a transaction recorded in a ledger. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to it. A crack in the ice, a flicker of recognition, there and gone as quickly as it appeared. "Good night," he said, and then he was gone, and I was alone in my beautiful new cage. I did not sleep that night. I sat by the window, wrapped in a blanket softer than anything I had ever owned, watching the rain fall over the vast grounds of Ashford Hall. The gardens stretched into darkness, punctuated by the shapes of hedges and fountains and trees whose branches reached toward the sky like supplicating hands. In the distance, I could see the lights of what might have been a village, tiny pinpricks of gold in the sea of black. I tried to understand what I had gotten myself into. I was a duchess now, a married woman, the mistress of a great house, and yet I was still playing the same role I had played for 3 years, still trapped in the same silence, still invisible. But something was different. I could feel it in the air, in the way the house seemed to hold its breath around me, in the way the servants had watched me with something more than mere curiosity. There were secrets here, whispers that fluttered through the corridors like moths around a flame. The Duke had not married me out of need or desire, or even convenience. He had married me for a purpose, and I did not yet know what that purpose was. But I would find out. I always found out. That was my particular talent, my peculiar gift. I listened, and I watched, and I learned. And eventually, the secrets always revealed themselves to those patient enough to wait. The first secret came to me within a week of my arrival. I had fallen into a routine of sorts, the kind of schedule that takes shape naturally when there are no demands on one's time and nothing to fill the empty hours. I took my meals in my sitting room, delivered by a timid housemaid who seemed terrified of me despite my silence, or perhaps because of it. I wandered the vast halls when the mood struck me, exploring the labyrinth of corridors and staircases and forgotten rooms that made up this sprawling estate. I spent long hours in the library, which seemed to have been abandoned by everyone except the spiders, running my fingers along the spines of books that had not been touched in years. The servants treated me with a wary politeness that bordered on pity. They whispered when they thought I was not watching, speculating about my history, my condition, my relationship with the Duke. "Poor creature," I heard one of them say, "married to His Grace and cannot even speak to him. What kind of life is that?" I let them believe I was exactly what Mr. Pemberton had told them. Mute, simple, harmless. It was safer that way. It was always safer. But on the 7th day, I was in the library when I heard voices in the adjoining study. The door was slightly ajar, left open by some careless servant, and through the gap I could see the Duke seated at his desk, his head in his hands, while an older woman stood before him with the rigid posture of someone delivering unwelcome news. She was tall and thin, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. Her dress was expensive, but plain, the attire of someone who had no need to prove their status through ostentation. This, I would later learn, was Lady Constance Blackwood, the Duke's aunt and the unofficial guardian of the family's secrets. "The deadline is in 6 months," she was saying, her voice crisp and unyielding, cutting through the dusty silence of the library like a blade. "If you do not produce an heir by then, the estate passes to your cousin, Reginald. Everything, Sebastian. The house, the lands, the title, the fortune. 300 years of Blackwood history handed over to that wastrel because your father was too proud to trust you with the truth until it was nearly too late." The Duke raised his head, and I saw something in his face I had never expected to see. Despair. Raw and unguarded, the kind of despair that only comes from fighting a battle you know you cannot win. I am aware of the terms. "Aunt Constance," he spoke through gritted teeth, every word an effort. "I do not need you to recite them to me as if I were a child who had forgotten his lessons. Then you are also aware that a mute wife cannot exactly provide the verbal consent required for—" Lady Constance trailed off, her meaning clear. The law required consent. Consent required speech. A mute wife was, in the eyes of the law, incapable of either. I am aware. The Duke's voice was flat, dead, emptied of everything except exhaustion. I am aware of everything. I have made my choice. Your choice is madness. Lady Constance's tone sharpened with frustration. You married a woman who cannot speak, cannot consent, cannot give you the one thing you need. You have thrown away everything your family has built over centuries because you could not bear to take a normal wife and pretend to be a normal man. I could not bear to lie to another woman the way my father lied to my mother. The words hung in the air, sharp as broken glass. Lady Constance seemed to deflate slightly, her rigid posture softening into something almost like compassion. "Sebastian." Her voice was gentler now, touched with a grief that seemed personal rather than practical. "I know what you saw. I know what it did to you. But you cannot let one terrible memory destroy your entire future. Your father was a cruel man, yes. His treatment of your mother was unforgivable, but that does not mean all marriages must be the same." The Duke rose from his desk and walked to the window, his back to his aunt, his shoulders tight with tension. "I married Miss Ashworth because she cannot demand anything from me," he said. "She cannot plead or cajole or weep. She cannot make me into something I am not. With her I can be honest. I can be alone, even within a marriage. I can stop pretending that I am capable of the kind of love that women expect from their husbands." "And what of her?" Lady Constance pressed. "What of this woman you have purchased like a piece of furniture? Does her happiness not factor into your calculations? She has food, shelter, safety." He turned back to face his aunt, and his expression was closed, guarded, a door slammed shut against any attempt at sympathy. "She has more than she had before, and she will never know what it is to be disappointed by me. because she will never expect anything in the first place. I stepped back from the door, my heart racing, my mind spinning with everything I had just heard. The Duke had not married me because he needed a silent, compliant wife. He had married me because he was afraid of intimacy, afraid of expectation, afraid of becoming his father, of inflicting the same cruelties on a wife that his father had inflicted on his mother. And in choosing me, in choosing a woman who could not speak and therefore could not consent, he had also doomed himself to losing everything. I should not have cared. I had no reason to care. This man was a stranger who had bought me for £10 and barely looked at me since. His problems were not my problems. His fate was not my fate. But I could not stop thinking about the despair in his voice, the loneliness in his eyes, the way he had spoken of his mother, of lies and cruelty and the scars that cruel men leave on the people who love them. I knew those scars. I wore them myself. The days that followed were strange and dreamlike, suspended in a kind of waiting that I could not name. I continued my silent wanderings through the house, but now I was watching for something specific. Now I was piecing together the fragments of a story that no one had ever intended to tell me. The Duke's mother had died when he was 19. This much I learned from the servants, who spoke of her in hushed tones as if her ghost still lingered in the halls. Her name had been Elizabeth, and she had been beautiful, they said. Kind. The only softness in a house that had been built on stone and silence. She had come to Ashford Hall as a young bride, full of hope and love, and she had slowly been destroyed by the man she had married. The old Duke had been a monster, cold, controlling, cruel in ways that left no visible marks but destroyed everything they touched. He had isolated Elizabeth from her family, forbidden her friendships, controlled her correspondence, decided what she wore and ate and read and said. He had crushed her spirit with 1,000 small cruelties, endless criticisms and cutting remarks and punishments for transgressions she did not know she had committed. By the end, there was nothing left of the woman she had been. She was a shell, hollow and fragile, going through the motions of life without any life left inside her. And Sebastian had watched it all. Sebastian had been powerless to stop it. Sebastian had held his mother's hand as she faded away and sworn that he would never, ever become his father. I understood now why he had chosen me. A mute wife could not be silenced because she was already silent. A mute wife could not be controlled because there was nothing to control. In his twisted logic, he was protecting me by expecting nothing from me. He was saving me from the fate his mother had suffered by ensuring that our marriage would be nothing more than a legal formality. But he was also destroying himself. The deadline his aunt had mentioned loomed over the house like a storm cloud, and with every passing day, I saw the Duke retreating further into himself, building walls so high and thick that no light could penetrate. He took his meals alone. He rode out at dawn and did not return until dark. He avoided me with such careful precision that I began to wonder if he had forgotten I existed at all. And yet, there were moments. Small moments, easily missed, easily dismissed. A pause in the hallway when our paths crossed, his eyes meeting mine for just an instant before he looked away. A flicker of something that might have been concern when he noticed me shivering in a cold corridor, followed the next day by a fire being lit in my sitting room hours earlier than usual. A book left on the table in the library, something on languages and linguistics, with a ribbon marking a page about the ways that trauma could steal a person's voice and the methods that had been used to coax it back. I did not know if he had left it for me to find or if it was simply coincidence. But I read it anyway, absorbing every word, recognizing myself in the descriptions of selective mutism and traumatic silence. And when I was done, I found another book waiting in its place, and then another, and then another. He was trying to understand me. In his own clumsy, distant way, he was trying to know who I was. the realization struck me like a blow to the chest. This cold, distant man, this duke who had bought me like property and barely spoken to me since, was leaving me books. He was thinking about me. He was wondering, just as I was wondering about him. I did not know what to do with this knowledge. I did not know what to do with the feelings it stirred in me. Feelings I had thought long dead and buried. So I did what I always did. I retreated into silence. I watched. I waited. And I let the strange, tentative connection between us grow in the shadows, unacknowledged and unnamed. The invitation arrived on a gray October morning, delivered by a footman whose livery was finer than anything I had ever owned. It was addressed to the Duke and Duchess of Ashford, which still felt like a mistake, a clerical error that no one had bothered to correct, and it requested our presence at a diplomatic reception hosted by the Austrian ambassador. The event would be attended by dignitaries from across Europe, representatives of governments and noble houses and commercial interests that spanned the continent. It would be an opportunity for the Duke to strengthen his political alliances and demonstrate that his sudden marriage had not diminished his standing in society. I learned all of this from Lady Constance, who summoned me to her sitting room and explained the situation with the brisk efficiency of a general planning a campaign. "You will attend," she said, and it was not a question. "You will wear something suitable, which I will provide. You will stand beside Sebastian and smile and look appropriately decorative. You will not attempt to communicate with anyone, as it will only draw attention to your limitations. Do you understand?" I nodded, keeping my expression blank, my eyes lowered. Inside, my heart was racing with something that felt almost like excitement. A diplomatic reception, dignitaries from across Europe, people who might speak French, German, Italian, Russian, Spanish, Latin, Greek. People who might say things they assumed no one could understand, things they would never say in front of anyone who could repeat them. This was either a tremendous opportunity or a terrible risk. I could not decide which. The dress Lady Constance provided was the finest thing I had ever worn. Pale blue silk with silver embroidery, cut in the latest fashion, with a modest neckline and sleeves that fell just past my elbows. A maid was sent to arrange my hair, a young woman named Sarah, who seemed determined to transform me into something presentable, despite my obvious unsuitability for the role. She brushed and pinned and twisted until my dark hair was swept up in an elegant arrangement that made me look like someone else entirely, someone who belonged in this world of wealth and privilege. When she was finished, I barely recognized the woman in the mirror. I looked like a duchess. I looked like someone who had been born to wear silk and jewels and attend diplomatic receptions on the arm of a duke. I looked like a lie. The Duke came to collect me himself, which surprised me. He appeared at the door of my sitting room precisely at 7 o'clock, dressed in evening black, his cravat tied with mathematical precision, his dark hair swept back from a face that seemed even more severe than usual. He stopped in the doorway and stared at me for a long moment, and something passed across his features that I could not read. "You look well," he said finally, and the words sounded as if they had been dragged from him against his will, torn from some locked place where he kept things he did not want to feel. I curtsied, the movement automatic, and allowed him to take my arm. His touch was light, impersonal, but I was acutely aware of the warmth of his hand through my glove, the way his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly as we descended the stairs. The carriage ride to the ambassador's residence was silent, as all our interactions were silent. But it was a different kind of silence now. Charged, expectant, as if we were both waiting for something to happen, something that would shatter the careful distance between us. The reception was everything I had imagined and more. The ambassador's residence blazed with light, every window glowing like a beacon in the darkness. Carriages lined the street, disgorging guests in silks and satins and jewels that caught the candlelight and scattered it like stars. The air was thick with perfume and conversation, and the soft strains of a string quartet playing somewhere in the depths of the house. The Duke led me through the crush of bodies with the ease of long practice, nodding to acquaintances, exchanging brief words with men whose names I did not catch, accepting congratulations on his marriage with a tight smile that never reached his eyes. I played my part perfectly, silent and smiling, a decorative accessory on his arm. No one spoke to me directly. No one expected me to respond. I was invisible in the best possible way, present but not participating, watching and listening and filing away every scrap of information. It was in the third hour of the reception that everything changed. We had drifted to the edge of the ballroom, near a cluster of men who were deep in conversation. The Duke was speaking with an elderly earl about something tedious, horses or hunting or whatever it was that men of his class discussed when they had nothing better to do, and I was standing beside him, my eyes fixed on nothing, my ears attuned to everything. The men nearby were speaking Russian. My heart stuttered in my chest. Russian. They were speaking rapid, fluent Russian, with the careless confidence of people who assumed no one around them could understand. Their voices were low, meant to be private, but I was close enough to catch every word. And what they were saying made my blood run cold. "The Duke of Ashford is a fool," one of them said. "His new wife is mute, did you hear? Mute and simple. He bought her from some tradesman for a pittance." The man laughed, a cruel sound that made my hands clench beneath my gloves. "A perfect wife for a man with secrets," another replied, and there was mockery in his voice that made me want to slap him. "He will never have to worry about her repeating anything she hears. She cannot speak even if she wanted to, assuming she can hear at all." The first man, again, dismissive. "But it matters not. We have the documents we need. By the end of the week, his shipping contracts will be ours, and he will never know what happened until it is too late. Does he suspect anything? How could he? He is too busy mourning his failure to notice what is happening under his own nose. The ambassador has played him perfectly. By the time Ashford realizes his fortune is gone, we will be safely back in St. Petersburg, counting our profits." More laughter, low and satisfied, the sound of men who believed they had already won. I forced myself to remain still, to keep my expression vacant, to give no sign that I had understood every word. But my mind was racing. Shipping contracts, documents, a plot against the Duke, orchestrated by someone in this very room, someone he trusted, someone who was smiling and shaking his hand while planning to destroy him. I had to warn him. But how? How could I warn a man who believed I could not speak, who had built his entire relationship with me on the foundation of my silence? The answer came to me in a flash of desperate inspiration. I reached out and touched the Duke's arm, the same gesture I had made on our wedding night, the same small breach of the wall between us. He turned, his brow furrowed with annoyance, and I met his eyes with an intensity I had never allowed myself before. And then, very slowly, very deliberately, I tilted my head toward the men who were still speaking Russian, their voices lowered now, but still audible to anyone who knew how to listen. The Duke followed my gaze. He looked at the men. He looked back at me. And in his eyes, I saw the first flicker of something like recognition. "You understand them," he said, so quietly that I almost did not hear him. "You understand what they are saying." I did not nod. I did not shake my head. I simply held his gaze and let him see the truth in my eyes. His hand closed over mine, warm and strong, and he pulled me away from the ballroom, through a series of corridors and antechambers until we reached a small study at the back of the house. He closed the door behind us and turned to face me, and in the lamplight I saw that his face had gone pale. "Who are you?" he asked, and his voice was rough with something that might have been fear or might have been wonder. "Who are you really?" I stood there in that small study, with my husband's eyes burning into mine, and I made a choice. I had kept my silence for 3 years. I had hidden behind it, sheltered within it, used it as a shield against a world that had never shown me kindness. But this man, this cold and wounded man who had bought me for £10 and left me books about trauma and loss, this man who was about to be betrayed by people he trusted, he deserved the truth. I opened my mouth, I took a breath, and I spoke. The Austrian ambassador is working with Russian agents to steal your shipping contracts. They have forged documents, and they plan to execute their scheme by the end of the week. The men in the ballroom were discussing it in Russian because they assumed no one present could understand them. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, rusty, unused, like a door that had been closed for so long that the hinges had forgotten how to move. But the words came out clearly enough, and I watched the Duke's face as their meaning sank in. He stared at me. He stared at me for so long that I began to wonder if I had made a terrible mistake, if he would call for the guards and have me committed to an asylum for the clearly insane. But then he spoke, and his voice was barely a whisper. "You can speak." It was not a question. It was a revelation. And in his eyes, I saw something crack, something shift, as if the very foundations of his understanding were being rearranged. "Yes," I said, and the word felt like the first step across a threshold I had been standing before for years. Yes, I can speak. I chose not to, for a very long time. I chose not to because silence was the only protection I had. But I am choosing differently now. Why? Because you are in danger. Because those men are planning to destroy you. Because I watched you leave books for me in the library. Books about trauma and recovery. And I know that beneath all your coldness, you are trying to be kind. And because I am tired, so very tired of being invisible. The Duke took a step toward me, then another, until he was close enough that I could see the pulse beating in his throat, the way his hands trembled slightly at his sides. "How many languages do you speak?" he asked, and there was awe in his voice now, genuine awe. "7. French, German, Italian, Russian, Spanish, Latin, and Greek. Also English, of course, though I suppose that hardly counts." He laughed. It was a strange sound, rusty and unused, as if he had not laughed in a very long time. 7 languages. I paid £10 for a woman who speaks 7 languages. "You paid £10 for a woman who was pretending to be mute," I corrected him. "The 7 languages were a bonus." Something shifted in his face then, something that looked almost like joy. But it was tempered by something else, something darker and more complicated. "Why did you pretend? Why did you let them think you could not speak?" I looked away, unable to meet his eyes any longer. It was too much being seen like this. It was too much after so long in the shadows. Because speaking got me nothing but pain. Because the world took everything from me. My mother, my father, my future, and I had no weapon left except my silence. Because if they thought I was broken, they stopped trying to break me further. I paused, gathering the courage to say the rest. And because I was afraid of what would happen if I let anyone see who I really was. And now I am still afraid. But I am more afraid of watching you lose everything to men who think you are too foolish to notice their schemes. The Duke was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was gentle in a way I had never heard before. "What is your real name? Your full name, the one you were born with?" "Vivienne Marguerite Ashworth de Valcourt. My mother was a French countess who died when I was 14. My father was a British diplomat who never acknowledged me publicly. I was raised in the courts of Europe until my mother died, and then I was sold to Mr. Pemberton, and then I was sold to you." I smiled, and there was no humor in it. I have been sold quite a lot, actually. It seems to be my particular talent. Not sold. His voice was fierce, suddenly fierce, in a way I had never heard. Never again. "You are the Duchess of Ashford, and no one will ever buy or sell you again. I swear it." I did not know what to say to that. I did not know what to do with the sudden warmth that bloomed in my chest, unfamiliar and frightening and desperately welcome. "We should return to the reception," I said finally. "If we are gone too long, it will raise suspicions." The Duke nodded, but he did not move toward the door. Instead, he reached out and took my hand, not pulling, not demanding, just holding it gently in his own. "Will you help me?" he asked. "Will you help me stop them?" I looked at our joined hands. I looked at his face, no longer cold, no longer distant, but alive with something I had never seen before. "Yes," I said. "Yes, I will help you." We returned to the reception as if nothing had happened, my hand on his arm, my expression smooth and vacant. But everything had changed. I could feel it in the way he stood closer to me now, the way his fingers brushed against mine when no one was looking, the way his eyes sought me out across crowded rooms with a new intensity. I could feel it in my own heart, beating faster than it had in years, awake and alive in a way I had almost forgotten was possible. The days that followed were unlike anything I had experienced since coming to Ashford Hall. The Duke and I met each morning in his study, the door locked against curious servants, and I told him everything I had learned. I told him about the conspiracy against him, piecing together fragments I had overheard at the reception and details I gathered through careful observation of the servants and visitors who came and went from the house. He listened with an intensity that made me feel seen in ways I had never been seen before, asking questions, making notes, treating my information as the valuable intelligence it was. We were partners now, allies in a battle that neither of us had chosen, but both of us were determined to win. But it was more than that. In those quiet morning hours, with the fire crackling in the grate and the weak autumn sun filtering through the windows, we began to know each other. Really know each other, not as buyer and commodity, not as Duke and Duchess, but as Sebastian and Vivienne. He told me about his mother, about watching her fade away under his father's cruelty, about the guilt that had haunted him ever since, the certainty that he should have done more, should have been stronger, should have saved her somehow. I told him about my mother too, about the way she had loved my father despite everything, despite his abandonment and his cowardice and his final, unforgivable betrayal. About the way I had sworn, watching her die, that I would never let anyone have that kind of power over me again. We were both survivors of broken love. We were both scarred by parents who had failed us in different ways. And in recognizing ourselves in each other, we began to build something new. It was not romance. Not yet. It was something more fragile and more precious. Trust. But the romance came later. Of course it did. It began with small things. A brush of fingers when he handed me a document, a lingering glance across the breakfast table. The way his voice softened when he said my name, as if the syllables were something precious that deserved careful handling. I tried to ignore it. I tried to remind myself of all the reasons why caring for this man was dangerous, why letting myself feel anything would only lead to pain. But my heart, it seemed, had not received the message. 3 weeks after the reception, the Duke asked me to teach him Russian. I laughed when he made the request, genuinely laughed, and the sound surprised both of us. "Why on earth would you want to learn Russian?" "Because," he said, and there was a hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth, "I would like to be able to understand my enemies without relying on my wife to translate." Your wife. The words sent a shiver through me that I could not entirely explain. And so I taught him. Every afternoon, in the library where he had once left books for me to find, I introduced him to the Cyrillic alphabet and the complex rules of Russian grammar. He was a terrible student, his accent atrocious, his memory for vocabulary abysmal. But he tried. He tried so hard, and there was something unbearably endearing about watching this proud, powerful man stumble over basic pronunciation like a schoolboy struggling with his first lessons. It was during one of these lessons, 3 weeks into our arrangement, that he kissed me for the first time. We were reviewing verb conjugations, of all things. He had just butchered the past tense of a particularly difficult word, and I was laughing, Really laughing, the kind of laughter that made my stomach ache and my eyes water. And he was looking at me with an expression I had never seen before, something soft and wondering and almost disbelieving. "What is it?" I asked, still catching my breath. "You are beautiful," he said simply. "When you laugh, when you speak, when you simply exist in a room, you are the most beautiful woman I have ever known." And before I could respond, before I could build my walls back up and retreat into the safety of silence, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to mine. It was a gentle kiss, almost tentative, as if he were asking a question he was afraid to hear the answer to. But I answered it anyway. I answered it by reaching up and tangling my fingers in his hair, by pulling him closer, by kissing him back with all the longing I had been trying so hard to deny. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathing hard, he rested his forehead against mine and closed his eyes. "I did not mean for this to happen," he whispered. "Neither did I. I swore I would never." He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. "I know." I pulled back just far enough to meet his eyes. "I know what you swore. I know what you are afraid of. But I am not your mother, Sebastian. And you are not your father. We do not have to repeat their mistakes." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw the war playing out behind his eyes. Fear against hope. Past against present. The memory of everything he had lost against the possibility of everything he might gain. "What if I hurt you?" he asked, and his voice was raw with the question. "What if I become everything I swore I would never be? Then I will tell you. I will speak up, and I will fight back, and I will not let you destroy me. I am not silent anymore, remember? I have a voice now, and I intend to use it." Something shifted in his face. The fear did not disappear, but it was joined by something else, something that looked almost like hope. "I do not deserve you," he said. "Probably not," I agreed. "But here we are nonetheless." He laughed, and it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The kiss changed everything and nothing. We were still partners. We still met every morning to discuss the conspiracy against him, which was progressing apace. My translations had helped him identify the key players, and he had begun taking steps to protect his interests. Documents were moved to safer locations. Trusted solicitors were consulted. A counter-strategy was developed, one that would turn the conspirators' own weapons against them. But now there was something else between us, something warm and fragile and terrifying in the best possible way. We did not speak of it directly. We did not make declarations or promises or plans, but we kissed again and again. And each time, the walls between us crumbled a little more. He told me about the deadline, finally, about the terms of his father's will, the requirement that he produce an heir before his 35th birthday or lose everything. He told me with shame in his voice, as if the very existence of such a clause was evidence of some personal failing. I listened without judgment. I had learned long ago that shame was a poor foundation for anything, and I refused to add to his burden. "Your father was a cruel man," I said when he had finished. "This condition was designed to control you even from the grave. But we do not have to let it define us. If I do not produce an heir, I know. It would mean losing everything, the house, the title, the legacy of 300 years. I know." He looked at me with something like desperation. "I cannot ask you to. We have not even—" He struggled to find the words. "This was not the arrangement. When I married you, I never intended." I reached out and took his hand. The same gesture I had made on our wedding night, the same small breach of the distance between us. "What do you intend now?" He was silent for a long moment, and then, slowly, he raised my hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to my palm. "I intend to love you," he said, "if you will let me. I intend to love you for the rest of my life, whether we save the estate or not. I intend to be worthy of the gift you have given me, the gift of your voice, your trust, your heart." I felt tears prick at my eyes, and I did not try to stop them. For so long, I had believed that I was unworthy of love, that I was damaged goods, broken beyond repair. But this man, this complicated and wounded and wonderful man, was looking at me like I was the most precious thing in the world. "I love you too," I said, and the words felt like coming home. "I love you, Sebastian. Not because of your title or your wealth or your legacy. I love you because you left books for a woman you thought could not read them. I love you because you are trying so hard to be better than your father. I love you because when I finally spoke, you listened." He pulled me into his arms then, held me tight against his chest, and I felt his heart beating against mine, steady and strong. "Whatever comes next," he murmured into my hair, "we face it together." Together, I agreed. And for the first time in my life, I believed it. The diplomatic reception that would change everything was scheduled for the first week of December. It was to be held at Ashford Hall, hosted by Sebastian himself, and it would bring together all the key players in the conspiracy against him. The ambassador, the Russian agents, the English lords who had been seduced by promises of profit and power. They were coming to our home, confident that their schemes were about to bear fruit. They did not know that we were ready for them. The plan was simple but risky. Sebastian would host the reception as if nothing were amiss. I would circulate among the guests, silent and invisible as always, listening for any final details of their scheme. And at the crucial moment, when the conspirators believed they had won, we would spring our trap. It required perfect timing. It required nerves of steel. It required trust. It required me to speak in public for the first time since I had taken my vow of silence. I will not pretend I was not afraid. I was terrified. The thought of standing before all those people, of revealing the deception I had maintained for years, made my stomach churn and my hands shake. But I had made a choice. I had chosen to be visible. I had chosen to be heard, and I would not let my fear stop me now. The night of the reception arrived cold and clear, with stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on velvet. Ashford Hall blazed with light, every candle lit, every surface polished to a mirror shine. The guests arrived in their finery, all false smiles and calculating eyes, and Sebastian greeted them with the easy charm of a man who had nothing to fear. I stood beside him, silent and still, playing my role one last time. The ambassador was effusive in his compliments, his accented English dripping with insincerity. "Such a beautiful home, Your Grace, such a beautiful wife. What a pity she cannot appreciate the conversation." I kept my expression blank, my eyes downcast. Inside, I was counting the minutes until his downfall. The evening progressed as such evenings do, with food and wine and empty chatter. I drifted through the crowd, catching fragments of conversation in 4 different languages, piecing together the final details of the conspiracy. The documents were to be presented at midnight. The signing would take place in Sebastian's study. By morning, everything would be done. They were so confident, so certain of their victory. At 11:30, Sebastian caught my eye across the crowded ballroom. A single nod, almost imperceptible. It was time. I made my way to his side, and together we walked to the front of the room. The musicians fell silent. The guests turned to watch, curious about this unexpected interruption. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sebastian said, his voice carrying easily across the space. "I thank you for joining us this evening. Before we continue with the festivities, I have an announcement to make." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The ambassador's eyes narrowed slightly. "Many of you know that my wife, the Duchess of Ashford, is unable to speak." Sebastian paused, and a small smile played at the corner of his mouth. "I am pleased to inform you that you have been misinformed." And then he turned to me, and in his eyes I saw all the love and trust and faith he had placed in me. "Your Grace," he said, "would you care to address our guests?" I stepped forward. I lifted my chin. I opened my mouth, and I spoke. "Good evening," I said, and my voice rang out clear and strong across the silent room. "My name is Vivian Marguerite Ashworth de Valcourt, Duchess of Ashford. For the past 3 years, I have allowed the world to believe I was mute. I allowed it because it suited me to be invisible, to be overlooked, to be underestimated. But tonight, I have a different purpose." I turned to face the ambassador, whose face had gone pale as milk. I continued in Russian, watching his expression shift from confusion to horror as he realized what was happening. "I know about the forged documents. I know about the plan to steal my husband's shipping contracts. I know about every conversation you and your associates have had over the past 2 months because you were foolish enough to speak freely in front of a woman you believed could not understand you." The room erupted. Voices rose in shock and outrage, in denial and accusation. But I was not finished. I switched to French, addressing the continental businessmen who had been part of the scheme. "I know about your involvement as well. The bribes you accepted, the lies you told. Every detail, every name, every figure. Then German, then Italian, then Spanish, cycling through languages with the ease of long practice, watching the conspirators squirm as they realized the extent of their exposure. Their faces were studies in terror, in disbelief, in the dawning recognition that they had been outmaneuvered by a woman they had dismissed as worthless. When I finally fell silent, the room was in chaos. But Sebastian was at my side, his hand warm and steady on the small of my back. "The authorities have been notified," he announced, his voice cutting through the noise. "I expect you all to cooperate fully with their investigation. Those of you who were not involved in this scheme are, of course, free to leave with my apologies for the disruption to your evening." The conspirators were led away, their protests fading into the night. The remaining guests departed in various states of shock and fascination, their whispers already spinning tales that would spread across London by morning. And when the house was finally empty, when the candles were burning low and the silence had returned, Sebastian took me in his arms and held me as if he would never let go. "You were magnificent," he said against my hair. "I was terrified. You did not show it. I have had practice at hiding." He pulled back to look at me, and his eyes were shining with something I had never seen before. Pride, joy, love. "No more hiding," he said. "Not from me. Not ever again." I reached up and touched his face, tracing the sharp lines of his jaw, the curve of his mouth. "No more hiding," I agreed. "I promise." He kissed me then, slow and deep, and full of everything we had not yet said. And when we finally broke apart, breathless and laughing, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together. The aftermath of that night was chaotic and complicated, stretching on for weeks as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. The conspirators were arrested one by one, their schemes unraveled, their carefully constructed lies dismantled by investigators who followed the trail of evidence I had helped Sebastian compile. The ambassador was recalled in disgrace, his diplomatic career ended by the scandal he had caused. His co-conspirators faced criminal charges, their assets seized, their reputations destroyed beyond any hope of recovery. The Russian agents were expelled from the country, sent home to face the displeasure of superiors who did not tolerate failure. Sebastian's business interests were not only secured, but strengthened. The shipping contracts that the conspirators had attempted to steal were renegotiated on far more favorable terms, and the exposure of the scheme earned him a reputation for shrewdness that attracted new partners and opportunities. His position in society, which had been weakened by his reclusive behavior and his unconventional marriage, was restored and enhanced. He was no longer the cold, distant duke who had purchased a mute bride. He was the brilliant strategist who had turned his enemies' weapons against them. But there were also quieter consequences, ripples that spread through our household in ways both expected and surprising. Lady Constance, for all her initial skepticism, became something almost like an ally. She still had her sharp tongue and her rigid standards, But there was a new respect in the way she looked at me, a grudging admiration that she expressed through small kindnesses rather than direct words. She began including me in decisions about the household, seeking my opinion on matters of entertaining and protocol. She even, on one memorable occasion, complimented my command of languages, though she followed it immediately with a criticism of my posture that somewhat diminished the effect. The servants, too, changed in their behavior toward me. Where once they had treated me with pity and condescension, they now approached me with something closer to awe. The story of my revelation at the reception had spread through the household within hours, growing more dramatic with each retelling until I barely recognized myself in the tales they whispered. I was a spy, according to one version, a foreign princess in hiding, according to another. The truth was more mundane, but I did not correct their fantasies. Let them believe what they wished. I had spent enough of my life trying to be invisible. If they wanted to see me as something extraordinary, I would not deny them the pleasure. But more important than any of that was what happened between Sebastian and me. We fell in love. Truly, completely, irrevocably in love. It happened slowly at first, in the quiet moments after the storm. Long conversations by the fire, sharing the stories we had never told anyone, peeling back the layers of protection we had both wrapped around ourselves. I told him about Vienna, about the glittering ballrooms where my mother had danced and laughed and lived as if the world could not touch her. He told me about his boyhood at Ashford Hall, about the rare moments of tenderness with his mother that had been all the more precious for their scarcity. We walked through the frost-covered gardens, our breath making clouds in the cold air, our footsteps crunching on the frozen grass. He showed me his favorite places. The old oak tree, where he had hidden as a boy when his father's rages became too terrible. The fountain that had been his mother's pride and joy. The folly at the edge of the lake, where he had dreamed of escaping to a life that did not feel like a prison. I showed him my treasures in return. The locket with my mother's portrait. The single letter she had written me at school that I had kept all these years. The sketch I had made of her from memory when the pain of losing her had become unbearable, and I had needed something, anything, to hold on to. Nights spent learning each other in ways that went far beyond words, discovering the language of touch and tenderness and trust. The first time he held me through the night, not demanding anything, simply being present, was the night I finally understood what it meant to feel safe. The first time I reached for him of my own volition, not because I was expected to, but because I wanted to, was the night he wept with something that looked like relief. Sebastian was different now. The walls he had built around himself were crumbling day by day, and what emerged from behind them was a man I had never expected. Gentle, funny, passionate in ways that left me breathless. He had a dry wit that emerged when he was relaxed, a talent for mimicry that had me laughing until my sides ached, and a capacity for tenderness that seemed at odds with everything I had first believed about him. He brought me flowers from the greenhouse, carefully selected arrangements that he delivered to my sitting room each morning with a solemnity that made me want to both laugh and cry. He read poetry to me in his terrible Russian accent, making me laugh until I cried, then switched to French to prove that he was capable of better when he tried. He held me when the nightmares came, the old dreams of my mother's death and Mr. Pemberton's cruelty, and he never once asked me to be anything other than what I was. And I, in turn, let myself be loved. It was harder than I had expected, that letting go. Years of self-protection do not dissolve overnight. There were moments when I still flinched from his touch, when old fears rose up and made me want to retreat into the safety of silence. But Sebastian was patient. He waited. He gave me space when I needed it and held me close when I needed that instead. He learned to read my moods, to sense when I was struggling, to offer comfort without making me feel weak for needing it. I let myself be seen. I let myself believe, for the first time in my life, that I was worthy of happiness, that love was not something reserved for other people, better people, People who had not been broken and sold and discarded like rubbish. And then, when spring arrived with its promise of new beginnings, I discovered that I was carrying our first heir. I knew before the doctor confirmed it, some ancient feminine wisdom stirring in my body and whispering secrets that could not be denied. The signs were unmistakable once I knew what to look for. The tenderness, the tiredness, the way certain foods that I had once loved now made me feel faintly ill. I kept the knowledge to myself for a week, savoring the secret, hardly daring to believe that it could be true. When I finally told Sebastian, I did it in the library, in the same room where he had once left books for me to find, in the same room where he had first kissed me and changed the course of both our lives. Sebastian wept when I told him. Actually wept. This cold and controlled man who had spent his entire life building walls against the world. He fell to his knees and pressed his face to my stomach and cried like his heart was breaking and mending all at once. I held him there, stroking his dark hair, feeling the shake of his shoulders against my body, and I wept too, though whether from joy or relief or simply the overwhelming enormity of what we had created, I could not say. The deadline was met with months to spare. The estate was saved. The legacy was secured. But none of that mattered as much as the simple fact that we had found each other, that we had built something real and true out of the wreckage of our pasts. Lady Constance, when she learned the truth about me and the coming heir, was so shocked that she actually smiled. It transformed her face entirely, revealing the woman she might have been if life had been kinder, if she had not spent decades guarding the secrets of a family that had brought her more pain than joy. 7 languages, she said, shaking her head in disbelief, and now an heir on the way. I suppose I owe you an apology, Vivienne. I thought Sebastian had lost his mind when he married you. I see now that he found it instead. It was the closest thing to approval I was ever likely to get from her, and I treasured it accordingly. The months that followed were the happiest of my life. I grew round with our coming son or daughter, and Sebastian hovered over me like a mother hen, terrified that something would go wrong, that happiness would be snatched away at the last moment as it had been snatched from him so many times before. He would not let me climb stairs unassisted. He had the kitchen prepare special meals based on recommendations from every medical text he could find. He hired a nurse 3 months before the baby was due, just in case, and interviewed 4 different doctors before settling on one he deemed worthy of attending me. I teased him for his worry, but secretly I loved it. I had never had anyone care for me like that. I had never known what it felt like to be precious to someone, to be the center of someone's world, to matter so much that even the thought of my discomfort caused distress. The baby arrived on a warm June night after hours of labor that tested every ounce of strength I possessed. The pain was like nothing I had experienced, wave after wave of it crashing over me until I was certain I could bear no more. But Sebastian was there, holding my hand, wiping my brow, murmuring words of encouragement that I could barely hear through the roaring in my ears. And when at last it was over, when the final push brought our daughter into the world with a lusty cry that filled the room and my heart and everything between them, I understood at last what my mother had meant when she spoke of love. It was a girl, a perfect, screaming girl with her father's dark hair and my mother's sea-glass eyes. We named her Marguerite, after the grandmother she would never meet, but whom I would tell her stories about until she knew her as well as if she had been there. And when Sebastian held her for the first time, his large hands so gentle around her tiny body, I saw in his face the same wonder I felt in my own heart. We had done it. Against all odds, against every expectation, against the weight of our histories and the cruelty of the world that had tried so hard to break us, we had built something beautiful out of the ruins of our broken pasts. I think sometimes about the woman I was before that rainy Tuesday when Sebastian Blackwood bought me for £10. I think about her silence, her invisibility, her desperate certainty that she was worth nothing at all. She was wrong. She was so very wrong. Because worth is not determined by price. It is not measured in pounds and pence. It is built through the choices we make, the voices we raise, the love we dare to accept and return. I was sold as a mute bride, but I found my voice. I was bought for a bargain, but I became priceless. I was expected to be silent, but I spoke 7 languages, and in the end, the language that mattered most was the one that needed no words at all. The language of love, of trust, of 2 broken people choosing, against all odds, to be whole together. Sebastian and I lived many years together in Ashford Hall, raising our family, weathering the storms that life inevitably brings. There were difficult times, of course, moments of doubt and fear, old wounds that opened without warning and had to be tended with patience and grace. But we faced them together, as we had faced everything since that first night when I opened my mouth and changed both our fates. The story of the mute duchess who spoke 7 languages became legend in London society. People whispered about me at parties, pointed me out in ballrooms, invented wild tales about my past that were far more dramatic than the truth. I let them whisper. I had spent enough of my life being invisible. If they wanted to make me a legend, I would not stop them. But the real legend, the one that mattered, was simpler than any of their stories. It was the legend of 2 people who had given up on love and found it anyway. 2 people who had been broken by the world and chose to heal each other instead of remaining shattered. 2 people who proved that it is never too late to speak, never too late to be heard, never too late to begin again. When I was very old, with grandchildren playing at my feet and the weight of a full life settling comfortably on my shoulders, Sebastian asked me if I had any regrets. I thought about the question for a long time. I thought about my mother, who had loved unwisely but fiercely. I thought about my father, whose cowardice had shaped my early years. I thought about Mr. Pemberton and his cruelty, about the years of silence and invisibility, about all the pain that had led me to that cold drawing room on that rainy Tuesday. And then I looked at my husband, this man who had bought me and freed me and loved me beyond all reason, and I smiled. "Not one," I said. "Not a single one." He smiled back, that rare and precious smile that I had worked so hard to earn, the smile that still, after all these years, made my heart skip a beat. "Nor I," he said, "nor I." And in the end, that was enough, more than enough. It was everything.